Franz Halder. Nobody loves him, everybody hates him. Or at least we should. Prior to Operation Crusader, Halder was scheming once again, this time to defeat Rommel, his own German general. Therefore, it's time to take a look at what Halder was doing and what impact he would have on the state of Axis forces in North Africa. After Halder's influence, would they be prepared to meet the British offensive? What was the position of their forces? Did they have enough tanks and other weapons? And what was Rommel thinking? Let's answer these questions today. Notes and sources will be in the pinned comment. Timestamps to various parts of the video will be in the description. In order to give context to the Halder plot, we need to talk about Rommel and the situation that he was in. Rommel has achieved legendary status in the annals of World War II history. A mere glance in the history section of a bookstore will show you just how dominant Rommel is in the historiography. Vast quantities of Rommel books have been written, probably more than any other general in the Second World War, and he continues to have this aura about him in the eyes of many history buffs. But the reality was that Rommel was a human being, and humans are not legends or myths, they are flawed. We have this perception of Rommel as a great military leader, and that's fine, but great military leaders lose battles, and many seem to have forgotten about the battle Rommel lost in 1941. Rommel had seen extensive action in World War I, gaining Germany's highest award for bravery, the Pour le Mérite Cross. However, Rommel had had a different war to most German or even Western Allied generals because he'd fought in Romania and Italy and avoided most of the static trench warfare on the Western Front. He therefore drew different conclusions than many of his peers on how to fight a modern war. Rommel had become head of Hitler's security battalion before being placed in charge of 7th Panzer Division, which he commanded during the Battle of France. When he arrived in North Africa in 1941, he quickly took to the offensive before his forces were even ready, and wiped out a British armoured division from the map. He drove the British back 640 kilometres to the Egyptian frontier, captured the best commander the British had at the time, and then repulsed 2 armoured operations against his forces. He was, therefore, beginning to be seen as an exceptional commander by the British, the beginnings of a reputation that would last till today. But he had failed to take Tobruk, and his superiors, Halder and Paulus, had lost confidence in his ability to wage this campaign. He'd also lost the confidence of some of his officers, with several having to be replaced. The Italians were also not impressed, so there were definite downsides to Rommel's command style, as we'll see in the upcoming battle. However, it was events outside of North Africa that would dictate the course of Rommel's career. Hitler meets with Mussolini on the 2nd of June 1941. This meeting allows Field Marshal Keitel, the chief of the OKW, to discuss military matters with General Cavallero, the chief of staff of the Italian Armed Forces. Having discussed other issues, the 2 chiefs of staff turned to North Africa. They agreed that they had to sort out the supply issues in the Mediterranean before another offensive could begin. Without a secure sea route or good air defences, supplies for the troops in North Africa would be limited. Both agreed that an offensive could not be considered until the autumn at the earliest. Cavallero wanted Italian forces to be reinforced, since they were quite depleted at this point, but Keitel said that it was unlikely because they couldn't supply the troops that they already had there. The number of mouths must therefore be kept to a minimum. Keitel said that the 5th Light Division, what would become the 21st Panzer Division, had proven that it wasn't the number of men that counted. What mattered most was the quality of the units, the weapons it had, and good logistics. All these were bigger factors than raw numbers of men. Therefore, the best strategy would be for the Italian infantry units to move to static defensive or besieging positions to free up the armoured and motorised divisions for more mobile actions. The priority then was to bring both German armoured divisions up to full strength, along with the Italian Ariete armoured and the Trieste motorised divisions. Ideally, 2 or 3 additional motorised divisions would be needed, as well as troops for safeguarding the lines of communication in addition to strong air and anti-air forces, supply and logistical units. But Halder, Chief of Staff of the OKH, had a different plan, a cunning plan. By this point, he hated Rommel. His diary is scathing of Hitler's star general, saying Rommel cannot cope with the situation. This was why Halder had sent Rommel to North Africa in the first place, to get rid of him. Now Rommel was causing him even more trouble, so Halder launches his cunning plan to rein Rommel in. What this says about Halder is at once intriguing and disturbing. His personal hatred, the sentiment was now too strong to merely call it dislike, of Rommel had become so intense that he was prepared to undermine German operations and strategy for the sole purpose of embarrassing Rommel. Halder's cunning plan is to separate Rommel from active command of Italian troops, and he would do this by placing all Axis units under Italian control, an offer which he knew the Italians would snap up in an instant. This would have the benefit of solving the command issues going on in the south, even though the Germans would lose direct command of their units. So, what Halder did was send Lieutenant General Alfred Gauser to North Africa. Gauser was to be a liaison officer between the OKH and the Italians, and what Halder hoped was that, because Gauser was there, the Italians would be prompted to form an army headquarters with an Italian general in charge, and Gauser would be the German representative at that army HQ. If they did make an army HQ, Gauser was instructed by Halder to take up that position and not place himself under Rommel's command. Rommel would remain as a corps commander and take orders from Gauser and the Italians. Cavallero had already said he wanted an army headquarters in North Africa to fill the gap between the troops and the high command in Tripoli, so Gauser's presence was a move in that direction. But Gauser brought such a large staff with him that the Italians had to be persuaded to accept him. General Garibaldi, commander-in-chief in North Africa, was surprised by the sudden appearance of a new German liaison officer at his headquarters. Garibaldi obviously wasn't happy and protested that another German general had just shown up and he hadn't even been informed. Cavallero agreed with Garibaldi and prepared to forward his complaint straight to Berlin. Now, this wasn't what Halder had expected. He thought the Italians would use this opportunity to set up a new command structure in North Africa. So a complaint to Berlin would be bad, because if Hitler found out about the situation, Halder knew Hitler would side with Rommel and Halder would be in trouble. Therefore, Halder tried to appease Cavallero. However, Halder's cunning plan unravelled before his eyes, and this was for two reasons. First, because of Gauser, and second, because of Cavallero and his own agenda. Gauser had no interest in intrigue. He was actually a very straightforward, down-to-earth kind of guy, and therefore he dismissed Halder's motive for sending him over to Africa in the first place. When he arrived on the 15th of June 1941, Operation Battle Axe began, and Gauser saw firsthand just how good Rommel was as a field commander. He also saw how confident the German and Italian soldiers were becoming under Rommel's leadership, which had the potential to produce big results. This influenced his decision, which was to hand over his staff to Rommel and become Rommel's chief of staff. So Rommel was now in charge of an even larger force with better command and control than before. Then Cavallero decided that since Rommel was doing his own thing and embarrassing Garibaldi and the Italian command, that it wouldn't be right for a good Italian general to have to deal with Rommel. Therefore, Cavallero decided that General Bastico, a close friend of Mussolini and unpopular in military circles, should replace Garibaldi, and that Bastico should be in command of Rommel. This would place an unpopular Italian commander in command of one of the most hot-headed German generals, a general he wouldn't be able to control, which would cause him many problems and be very amusing to Garibaldi and Cavallero. So, what Cavallero did was order Garibaldi to withdraw his objections to General Gauser's arrival, And yes, he did propose the establishment of an Axis army headquarters in Africa, which would control all Italian and German military formations, but instead of having the Italians in charge, he insisted that Rommel should command it. And Bastico would be in charge of all Axis forces in Libya, thereby making him an army group commander in all but name. So Halder's plan went from trying to put an Italian general in charge of an army to curb Rommel, to having Rommel promoted to be in charge of this new Axis army. Yes, take that, Halder. As for Halder, he well knew that an appeal to Hitler to stop the promotion of a German general, especially one who was in many ways a protege, to overall operational command in a theatre held until then to have been a major Italian concern, would fall on deaf ears. The only success which Halder was able to snatch from the ruin of his plans to bring Rommel to heel was to insist that the new army group be called Panzer Group Afrika and not, as was first suggested, Panzer Group Rommel. So Rommel gained the rank of General de Panzertrooper, equivalent to a Lieutenant General in the British or Lieutenant General in US armies. Garibaldi was replaced by Bastico, and Gauser supported Rommel, a new relationship which would continue in many future operations, including in Normandy. Justice is served. Anyway, Bastico was now in command of all Axis forces in Libya, kind of like an army group command. Rommel was the army commander and would be subordinate to General Bastico. However, things weren't that simple. General Feld Marshal Albert Kesselring was in charge of the German side of the Axis as Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean. He was Rommel's immediate superior, although Rommel would also bypass him and go directly to Hitler when necessary. Kesselring had a very pleasant personality and would maintain good relations with the Italians. He would also ease tensions between Rommel and his Italian allies. However, it's obvious that the Axis high command structure was, well, it wasn't really a structure really. They may as well not have bothered, and it is this cobweb mess that would allow Rommel to get away with all sorts in the coming months. Considering that he had arrived 6 months before in charge of little but a single light division, and that in mid-June he had been battling to defend his position as commander of all German troops in North Africa, his position now in command of all Axis ground troops facing the original enemy, Britain, was a remarkable achievement, and one revealing talents not always included among those expected in a plain, bluff, straightforward soldier. As Halder's fury increased, so did his sense of personal risk, for Rommel was proving a far more dangerous opponent in the convoluted world of Axis military politics than had been anticipated. Germany had invaded many countries in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Even in countries like Austria, where no shots were fired, the short campaigns at the beginning of the conflict still provided the Germans with vital experience in conducting mobile warfare. By 1941, this experience had resulted in several clear doctrines, the most important of which, for Crusader, we will discuss today. The first, and definitely most relevant to Operation Crusader, was combined arms warfare. We've discussed the inadequacies of the British doctrine, and the German doctrine at this point had been further developed. The Germans understood that panzers needed to work with infantry, anti-tank guns, tank destroyers, artillery, Stukas, and so on, and their units, which we'll look at shortly, reflected this idea. They had a far better ratio between their tanks and infantry, artillery, etc. than the British at this point in the war, and their units were used to cooperating, ensuring maximum effectiveness of their arms. Another big factor was their manoeuvre warfare doctrine. This has been immortalised by the made-up term Blitzkrieg, but the actual term they used was Bewegungskrieg. In this war of movement, the idea was to break through the enemy's lines, assuming they had lines, encircle and destroy the enemy force, and then exploit. An enemy force that was encircled would be cut off from supplies, wouldn't be able to retreat, and would be destroyed from all sides. The Germans called this type of battle a Kesselschlacht, a cauldron battle. And this goes a long way back in German military tradition, so the officers and generals in 1941 knew what this was about and had practiced it on several occasions by this point. There was also 2 more doctrines which are related to one another, so we'll cover both at the same time. These are the Auftragstaktik and Kampgruppe doctrines. The mission was to do a certain thing. Officers would have the freedom to plan their battles and achieve local success. One of the ways this manifested itself was in the use of battle groups or Kampfgruppen, which we'll see a few times in this video. A Kampfgruppe was basically a bunch of units strapped together, given a leader and a task. So when you hear the term Kampfgruppe, just think of a group of various units lumped together. The point being, German units were orientated to achieve missions within battles, and these mixed groups were set up according to what was needed to achieve the mission. A little bit of infantry, some artillery, a few anti-tank guns, some tanks, generally a balanced force. This was a very flexible system, and on the tactical and operational levels, Kampfgruppen gave the Germans a local advantage. And then we have the Italians. The Italians had developed the War of Rapid Decision in the late 1930s under good old Marshal Graziani. This was their equivalent of the Blitzkrieg idea. However, the Italians had failed to put that into practice during the first invasion of Egypt in 1940. O'Connor then ran rings around them, and their mostly foot infantry were annihilated. Times had changed slightly. The Italians now had more mobile units at the front, much like the Germans, but there are still tons of foot infantry, and the Italian divisions were at a severe disadvantage compared to the British, as I will explain. Most of the Italian infantry divisions weren't motorised. Some were given the title semi-motorised, but this simply wasn't true. Maybe the HQ unit or part of the division was motorised, but the vast majority of the semi-motorised division wasn't motorised. This placed them at a severe disadvantage to the majority of British divisions because they were motorised. Prior to the war, the Italians had reduced their divisions from 3 infantry regiments to 2 infantry regiments. They'd done this because they realised that 2 infantry regiments could actually make their divisions faster and more mobile. Whether this is true or not is kind of mute because they never really got a chance to prove it. Their fast foot infantry went up against even faster motorised infantry divisions, and truck beats foot. So Italian divisions found themselves getting outmanoeuvred and surrounded by the enemy, or at least threatened to get surrounded, and this factor dominated Axis thinking. And this all comes back to one factor: oil. The Axis simply didn't have enough of it. Now, it is true that supplies were problematic in North Africa, but it is incorrect to assume that Rommel is entirely to blame for this. The reality was that the Italian Navy didn't have enough oil to fight the war in the Mediterranean. The result was that the British were interdicting the sea lanes. The British didn't have total dominance of the sea or the air, but the situation had got to the point where Italian battleships were delivering supplies to North Africa because the normal cargo ships were getting sunk so often, and battleships don't have much cargo space. In addition, the Libyan ports did not have the capability to take the capacity of the supplies now coming to North Africa. They simply couldn't handle that many ships. This is why Rommel was now desperate to take Tobruk, which will give him a new port from which to offload supplies. The fact that it was further east than the other ports was obviously a big factor which would allow him to move further east, but Tobruk would actually allow more supplies into North Africa overall, which would ease the supply issue immensely. Yes, Rommel had moved ahead to Tobruk, stretching his own supply lines, which didn't help the situation. But to claim it was entirely his fault, or that he didn't understand supplies, is simply untrue. We've seen in previous battles how Rommel told Halder that it was Halder's mess, and that Halder should sort it out. We also know that Rommel said himself they were fighting their battles with one eye on the fuel gauge at all times. So Rommel is definitely aware of the logistical problems, and this is why he was now so obsessed with Tobruk. When you look at it, the reason Rommel has this reputation as someone who's not good with logistics is because this is what Halder said. This is the long and short of it. Halder has dominated World War II's historiography and has influenced our opinions on Rommel. And to be clear, I'm not defending Rommel for the sake of defending Rommel. As you'll see shortly, I'm going to be very critical of Rommel's actions during Crusader, but to blame the supply situation entirely on Rommel is unfair. It was a combination of a lack of oil, the Italian Navy and Air Force, plus the Luftwaffe's inability to tackle the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force in the Mediterranean. And this also has to do with Malta holding out, which played a crucial role in all of this. And there was a bottleneck caused by the Libyan ports, which reduced the amount of supplies that could reach North Africa. Yes, arguably Rommel shouldn't have dashed off across the desert, and his failure to take Tobruk was a big issue. But arguably the main problems came before he'd even set foot on Libyan soil and were out of his control. But either way, the Axis was starved of supplies, especially oil, and there was also other problems, including Rommel. See? Told you I was going to be critical of him. Rommel was unhappy with all the general staff officers that were now in North Africa. Halder had actually sent Friedrich Paulus to assess the situation Rommel had supposedly got himself in, and over the course of 2 and a bit weeks, Paulus reined in Rommel. But Rommel wasn't happy with the rest of them. General Kirchheim, Colonel Olbricht, and Major Kern were court-martialed or dismissed for challenging one of Rommel's decisions. Von Schwerin asked to be transferred out of North Africa because he couldn't tolerate Rommel's command anymore. And Rommel's dismissal of Streich was seen as unjustified by the other officers. Then you have Gauser and his staff coming in as well. Just as it had been in France, not only was Rommel's temper volatile, it was mercurial. At one point he threatened General von Kirchheim with dismissal, then just hours later denied ever having done so. The number of formal complaints reaching Berlin in regard to Rommel's behaviour towards his subordinates reached such a point that von Brauchitsch felt compelled to reprimand Rommel in the bluntest possible language, informing him that he was threatening his own professional future. Part of the reason for Rommel's temper was the fact that he had refused to adopt to the desert climate. For months he continued to wear his standard uniform, while all the men around him worked in shirtless sleeves and cut-off trousers or shorts. The heat may have got to him, which helps explain why he was unhappy with his subordinates. As it was, the Afrika Korps command structure underwent a thorough house-cleaning in the weeks after Battle Axe, after which Rommel pronounced himself satisfied with the performance of his officers. In terms of other changes, part of one new German division is moved across to Libya. This was known as the Afrika Division, which we'll come back to. Italian forces were also reinforced, with the Trieste Motorized Division being sent to North Africa, along with other reinforcements. But despite this, the majority of Axis units were foot soldiers. The Axis now had 3 armoured divisions, the 15th and 21st Panzer, plus the Ariete, and the 1 motorised division, the Trieste, all of which had vehicles. But none of the infantry in the Afrika Division had lorries, and the other Italian infantry divisions were also on foot. So, while the British certainly had their problems in terms of equipment and doctrine, they at least had an army which was more motorised than their opponents. Speaking of which, let's take a look at the Axis forces. Difficult, aristocratic and foul-tempered, this was Ettore Bastico's North African command, which is at Benghazi. Rommel nicknamed him Bombastico and pretty much ignored him. However, Bastico was technically in command of all Axis forces in North Africa. Other than Rommel's army, Bastico had a separate unit under its direct command. This was General Gambara's Mobile 20th Corps. At the beginning of Crusader, this was south of Tobruk and was not under Rommel's command. This was done to spite Rommel, as the Italians didn't really want him to have all the power. 20th Corps has 2 divisions, the first being Barlotta's 132nd Ariete Armoured Division, and the second being Pizzione's 101st Trieste Motorised Division. So basically the best Axis units in North Africa were split into 2 portions under commanders that didn't see eye to eye. Fantastic. The Ariete consisted of 2 armoured regiments, 1 motorised Bersaglieri regiment, which was elite troops, 1 artillery regiment and a bunch of battalions. The division was camped at Bir el Gubi, south of Tobruk. Piazzoni's 101st Trieste Motorized Division consisted of 2 regular motorized infantry regiments, an attached motorized Bersaglieri regiment, 1 motorized artillery regiment, and an attached mixed battalion. The division is sat at Bir Hakeim. But apart from Gambara's corps, beneath Bastico's North African command is the star of the show, General de Panzertruppe Erwin Rommel and his Panzer Group Afrika. Rommel has Lieutenant General Gauser as his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Westphal as his Operations Officer, and von Mellithin as his Intelligence Officer. With Rommel promoted to Army Commander, he's now in command of 2 corps, the first of which is the Deutsches Afrika Corps, Rommel's old command. General Lieutenant Ludwig Crüwell is brought in to take command of the Afrika Corps. Crüwell had commanded 11th Panzer Division in what was arguably the biggest tank battle of the Second World War, the Battle of Dubno 1941. Considering that Operation Crusader was planned to be a tank battle because that's how the British wanted to fight it, and bearing in mind that the British generals had no experience with tanks, the British were going up against Crüwell, a general who had more than enough tank-on-tank experience to beat them hands down, so the odds were definitely against them. Crüwell's Deutsches Afrika Corps consists of 4 divisions, 3 German and 1 Italian. We have Neumann Zilko's 15th Panzer Division, which has 1 Panzer regiment of 2 battalions and a brigade of infantry with 1 regiment of 2 infantry battalions, 1 regiment of artillery, and several supporting battalions, engineer, anti-tank, reconnaissance, signals, etc. This division is located in a position west of Gambut at the beginning of Operation Crusader. The 2nd Division of Crüwell's Corps is von Ravenstein's 21st Panzer Division. This was the former 5th Light Division, which had been reinforced and had been renamed 21st Panzer Division. This division consists of 1 Panzer Regiment with 2 battalions, 1 Infantry Regiment with 2 battalions, 1 Regiment of Artillery and 4 support battalions. This division is located in positions east of Gambut at the beginning of Crusader. Now, I am going to have to point out that most sources say the 101st Schutzen Regiment did not have a 1st Battalion, but that makes no sense because that's the battalion that Major Wilhelm Bach surrendered with at Halfaya at the end of this battle. Spoiler alert. Bach commanded 1st Battalion but was defending the Halfaya Pass at the frontier, so perhaps this is why the battalion is missed out the order of battle. Bach's force had been heavily reinforced and now had 5 batteries of anti-tank guns, including 1 battery of 88mm flak guns. The only German unit apart from Bach's that I can confirm was at the frontier at this time was Captain of Reserves Enriquez's 300th Oasis Battalion. This was at Sollum and may have had 5 infantry companies at the time. The 3rd Division in Crüwell's Corps was Sumerman's Afrika Division. Bit of a weird division this, to the point that even the name is disputed. It's either the Afrika Division or the 90th Light Division. Now, some sources claim it changed names in November 1941, but other sources say it didn't, with one source saying regardless of the name change, it was always referred to as the Afrika Division by the troops, since it was actually raised in Africa. Later, it was also called the 90th Afrika Division, apparently. So for the sake of these North African campaign videos, I'm just going to call it the Afrika Division. Why? Because it distinguishes the unit, much like we don't call the Ariete the 132nd Armoured Division, because it's boring. Also, this picture isn't of Sumerman. I couldn't find a good picture of him, and I know some of you sent me a couple of pictures, but they weren't really usable, so this is just a random guy from the division. The Afrika Division is an infantry division with 2 Schutzen regiments. One of these has 3 infantry battalions, and the other has 2 infantry battalions and an artillery battalion. And there were other units in the division as well. The whole division was formed to give Rommel more German infantry and to help take Tobruk, which is why it's in a position on the eastern side of the Tobruk defences. Speaking of infantry, the 4th Division in Crüwell's Corps was Georgis's 55th Savona Infantry Division. This division consists of 2 infantry regiments, 1 artillery regiment, and a bunch of battalions. The division was stationed at the Egyptian frontier near the Halfaya Pass, supporting and supported by the German units we mentioned earlier. There was also a 900th Pioneer Battalion as well, which completes the Afrika Corps' order of battle, but this unit seems to be near Tobruk somewhere. Rommel's 2nd Corps was Navarini's 21st Corps. This corps was in the Tobruk area, forming the siege lines and preparing to attack the port. It consisted of 4 Italian divisions, the first being Stampione's 102nd Trento Motorized Division. This had 2 regular motorized infantry regiments with 3 battalions each, and a motorized Bersaglieri regiment with 2 battalions. The division also had an artillery regiment, a mixed engineer battalion, and an anti-tank battalion. Oh, and by the way, the motorized Trento division was 80% deficient in transport and therefore was motorized only in name. The 2nd Division in 21st Corps was Gloria's 25th Bellona Semi-Motorized Division. Again, just like the Trento, it wasn't really motorised. It consisted of 2 infantry regiments with 3 battalions each, an artillery regiment and a mixed engineer battalion. This division is stood on the eastern side of Tobruk, directly in the path of the 70th Division's breakout route, and therefore will play an important part in the upcoming battle. The 3rd Division in 21st Corps was General Zambon's 27th Brescia Semi-Motorized Division. Again, not really motorised. It had 2 infantry regiments, an artillery regiment, and a mixed engineer battalion and an additional machine gun battalion. This division held the western side of the Tobruk defences. The final division of 21st Corps was General Franceschini's 17th Pavia non-motorised division. This division was deployed to the south of Tobruk. Again, it consisted of 2 infantry and 1 artillery regiment, but it also had 1 engineer battalion, the 5th Light Tank Battalion, and the 6th Aosta Battalion to beef up its strength. So these were the 4 divisions of 21st Corps, but the Italians also had 6 extra artillery regiments and an engineer battalion as part of the corps to help tackle the Tobruk siege. I don't know where any of these units are deployed because they're not actually mentioned in the narrative, but they're there somewhere. The final unit in Rommel's Afrika army was Butcher's 104th Artillery Command Afrika. This was a German unit but wasn't part of the Afrika Corps. It was at brigade strength and was nicknamed Rommel's Travelling Circus by the British, mainly because it was an artillery unit. It's basically a Kampfgruppe formed around the 221st Artillery Regiment, which was reinforced with additional batteries, including 2 batteries of French 155mm guns. This unit was there to pummel the British at Tobruk into submission. So, this is the initial Axis order of battle for Operation Crusader. One thing that needs to be noted is the fact that the German panzer divisions were more balanced than the British forces. Not only do the Germans have more infantry in their armoured divisions, but they have a more all-rounded force, with panzers, infantry and anti-tank guns all working well together. This combined arms integration gives the Germans an edge against the British on the tactical level. And this is before we get to the weapons. The Germans have an advantage in the anti-tank weapon category. This is primarily because they had mobilised earlier than the Allies had. Germany was gearing up for war since the early 1930s. Military spending was less than 1% of the budget in 1933 and was 10% in 1935. This was a bigger and quicker increase than ever seen before in peacetime in a capitalist state. Contrast this to the British, who certainly had a last-minute mobilisation in 1939. Therefore, the Germans had started manufacturing better guns much earlier than the British had, and it paid off. The Germans in 1941 were armed with the 50mm Pak 38. This could take out any British tank on the field of battle in the right circumstances. Its 50mm gun, firing solid shot, was similar to the British 2-pounder gun, and it did carry limited numbers of light armour-piercing shot known to the British as Arrowhead. This ammunition had very good penetration at short range and could even take out the heavily armoured Matilda tanks, although it would have to get pretty close to do so. But considering that the majority of British tanks were the cruiser tanks or the M3 light tanks, this gun could go through them at 1,000 yards (0.9 kilometers) without too much trouble. The British 2-pounders could not do the same to the standard German tanks at the time, the Panzer IIIs and IVs, so the German anti-tank guns could knock out the British tanks at a far longer range than the British could. We haven't even got to the 88mm gun yet, and the British have got a problem. The Germans have some older 37mm anti-tank guns, and these would struggle to take out any British tank in the desert. The main Italian anti-tank gun at the time was the 47mm weapon, which was a slightly higher calibre than the British 2-pounder, but it had pretty much the same penetration capability. These could easily deal with the Crusaders and M3 light tanks, again up to about 1000 yards, 0.9 kilometers, but wouldn't be able to take out the Valentines or Matildas at any range. However, both the German 37mm and the Italian 47mm guns were still effective versus reconnaissance vehicles and trucks, and they could also still disable a British tank by taking out the tracks, so they weren't completely useless. The Germans, of course, also had a handful of 88mm anti-aircraft guns in North Africa. There weren't many of these about, but some were located on the frontier in Bach's battalion and at Tobruk, as well as in the regular divisions. These would simply cut through a British tank well before the British tanks were in range to fire back. But again, there were few of these in number, and the point to take away is that the main problem the British faced in 1941 wasn't the 88mm guns, it was the standard German anti-tank guns, especially the 50mm Pak-38. With the Germans now receiving large numbers of the long-barrelled 50mm anti-tank gun Pak-38, which was nearly as effective as the Flak 88, the tactical advantage would remain decisively with the Germans unless the British armour doctrine and tactics were radically revised. For now, the German anti-tank guns ruled the desert battlefield. Early German mobilization also meant they had better tanks overall than the British. Not overwhelmingly better, the British could definitely take the German tanks out, but good enough that it did make a difference on the battlefield. And they had better doctrines. The Germans didn't split their tank force into cruisers and infantry tanks like the British. Instead, they kept their tanks bunched together and used the different tanks for different tasks. The Germans have three main tanks at this stage. The first is the lightly armoured Panzer II, which wasn't capable in a tank-on-tank fight since it only had a 20mm cannon. But it was very good at reconnaissance and infantry support, and therefore shouldn't be forgotten. However, by this stage it was obsolete and being replaced by bigger machines. Like the Panzer III, the main tank the Germans had in 1941. This was armed with a 50mm gun and was capable of taking on any British tank at this stage. Yes, it would struggle a bit with the Matildas, but since the British were splitting their infantry tanks from their cruiser tanks, the Panzer III wasn't really going up against Matildas. The Panzer III had 50mm of armour at the front, meaning that the British would have to get within 500 yards, 457 metres, to have a good chance of penetrating it. But they could take them out from the sides and rear, which were roughly 30mm thick. 25-pounders could take this out up to 1000 yards, 0.9 kilometres, although some of the Panzer IIIs had reinforced armour, so it depended on the model if they could do this or not. The point being that this tank was pretty well armoured and had a decent gun, wasn't prone to breaking down, and was definitely a more balanced machine overall to pretty much anything the British fielded at this time. But don't be fooled into thinking that the British couldn't take this out. They could at close range, but the British had to get within that range, which would be tough enough given the anti-tank gun support the Germans had, plus the fact that the British tanks like to break down all the time. And then we come to the Panzer IV. This has pretty much the same armour thickness as the Panzer III, so we won't dwell on that. The main difference between the two tanks at this stage is the gun. It has a low velocity 75mm gun, and this wasn't effective as an anti-tank weapon due to the low velocity. However, it was effective against unarmoured troops, could knock out gun positions, and was capable of damaging tanks even at long range. So the Panzer IV is basically a support tank at this point. But that gun, the 75mm, outranged the Panzer III and any British tank at this stage. It didn't have the range of a British 25-pounder, but it could get into range pretty quickly, and then hit the 25-pounders with effective high explosive rounds. This would either knock out the British artillery or cause the 25-pounders to pack up and leave. Therefore, this tank was very effective in combat and helped separate the British tanks from their anti-tank and artillery guns, making it easier for the Panzer III's and German artillery to do their job. The Italians' main tank at this stage was the M13/40 medium tank. This is armed with a 47mm gun, and the design of this tank is alright, although it had pretty light armour for a medium tank. In fact, its frontal armour of 30mm was actually as thick as the side armour of a British Crusader tank. Its side armour of 25mm was equal to the side armour of an M3 light tank. So was this really a medium tank? The 2-pounders could easily knock this out at 1,000 yards, 0.9 kilometers, but this tank could still be effective in a tank versus tank battle, as its gun could take out the British Crusader and M3 light tanks at the same distance they could knock it out, but it couldn't take on the Matildas or the Valentines at all. Overall then, while the Axis forces didn't have an equivalent to the Matilda tank at this stage in the war, the Germans especially were going into battle with better tanks than their opponents. Not overwhelmingly so, the British could definitely knock these things out, but overall the Germans had better gear, and as mentioned, this is primarily because the Germans mobilised earlier than the Allies. At the start of Operation Crusader, the Afrika Corps had 96 PaK 38s and 12 Flak 88s, as well as a bunch of 37mm anti-tank guns as well. At the frontier, most of the guns were Italian, stiffened with an additional 23 88mm guns. This is because the Germans expected the British to use their Matildas there. Combined, the Panzer Divisions had 70 Panzer IIs, 139 Panzer IIIs, 35 Panzer IVs, as well as some captured British Matildas. The Ariete had 146 Italian M13/40 tanks. This gave Rommel 7 tank battalions with a total of 390 operational tanks versus 30 corps strength of 477 tanks in 9 tank battalions. The Germans had 342 operational aircraft out of a total of 536. The Axis did have another 750 operational aircraft in other areas of the Mediterranean, but a lack of fuel and other British activities would prevent them from joining in on the fight. The Germans have around 65,000 men, and the Italians around 55,000, so it's 118,000 British versus 120,000 Axis troops, approximately. So, while the Axis were outnumbered in tanks and aircraft, they were not outnumbered in infantry. And I think it's possible for us to conclude that the Axis were in a pretty good position. They had fewer tanks than the British, but their tanks and anti-tank guns were slightly better. Their combined arms doctrine was also fully fleshed out, and their divisions were more balanced, giving them the advantage on the tactical level. There were disadvantages. The Germans have almost no tank reserves, and the first of their reinforcements only arrive in late December. They're also suffering from command, supply, and logistical issues. Overall though, if they play their cards right, the Axis have a good chance of winning this battle. And Rommel was eager to play his cards right. He had intelligence that said the British weren't preparing for an attack in the Western Desert, and he wanted to confirm this. So, prior to Crusader, he launched a raid across the Egyptian frontier in order to discover if the British really were preparing for an offensive. Next Monday, we'll take a look at Rommel's raid, Operation Sommersnachtstrom, and find out how Auchinleck outfoxed the Desert Fox. We'll also take a brief look at 2 British operations that should have impacted the Crusader battle but ultimately failed to do so. Operations Flipper and Squatter, the first being an assassination attempt on Rommel's life, and the latter being the first operation ever conducted by the newly formed SAS. And yes, they both didn't turn out so well. Thanks for watching, bye for now.